Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. In my own capacity and on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I wanted to welcome all of you here. Since today we are going to discuss the analysis that has been prepared last year with expert inputs, and now it has been finalized as a paper, and now everyone can have a look at it and discuss and use it for their work. Of course, the overall discussion is Belarus and Russia post-Putin, post-Lukashenko, the scenarios that are possible, and whether at all things can happen and what the developments can be. First, we have been discussing different approaches to tackling the issue of the lack of awareness about Belarus in Russia, and people in Belarus don't have any proper understanding of what's happening in Russia. Therefore, the domestic situation in both countries was an important thing to address. And for us, for the foundation, it is also an important issue because we want to develop the strategy to work with Russia and Belarus when and if transformation happens. But we need to come prepared, of course. We also mentioned that there has been growing mutual interdependence between Belarus and Russia in economic terms, first of all, and we also understand that this year could be a decisive year because the economy of Russia is currently stagnating. So yet the collapse has not yet happened and is not on the papers, is not in the cards, but I liked one of the inputs that mentioned that what they're doing now is burning through their future, meaning that they don't have a cushion for the future. And with this current state of affairs, we need to be aware of what possible developments can look like for Russia, because Russia is now paying a huge price for this war that they are waging, including in economic terms. Maybe this economic stagnation would lead to the war coming to an end, and then what we have discussed theoretically last year, and the things that you can read up on this year, all this can ultimately lead to all these theoretical discussions that and scenarios that we have been working on last year. We also spoke about the societies as such, because societies in Belarus and Russia are both alike and different. So it's important to understand the current state of affairs in each country and what needs to be done and what needs to be further analyzed, because we would want to continue this expert dialogue this year going forward in 2026, because some people still mean 2025 when they say this year, but no, we mean 2026. We should probably discuss whether we should also engage the experts and citizen activists from Belarus and Russia, well, mostly from Russia for that matter, maybe even political actors. I also wanted to remind you that just recently the Russian pro-democratic politicians who are now not in Russia have been introduced into the Russian delegation for the Council of Europe parliamentary delegation. So these are the people who could have been included in such dialogue. There's already a pool of people from Belarus who in the same capacity. And then I also just recently learned, but it's not actually a recent development, that there will be an election held in Russia for the State Duma. And also, it would be interesting to discuss whether these elections will have any function or whether it's all clear and there will be no real impact on anything, no matter how they go. But at the same time, I see that they are getting a bit nervous because the elections are scheduled for September, but still they're already trying to focus on that issue already. And but this nervousness, it tends to spill over between Belarus and Russia. So this is the outline of the things that we would be probably discussing. And I indeed thank our distinguished experts for the interesting analysis. It turned out quite interesting and is valuable for us to be able to assess what is happening in Belarus and Russia. And now I give the floor to our other panelists. Yes, thank you, Gabriele. I would like to add a few words here before we start with the analysis. I want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for supporting this project, which was enabled by the financial support and with the immediate involvement of the Vilnius office. And I also want to welcome all of you to a discussion of this analytical paper on post-Lukashenko and post-Putin Russia and Belarus. This project did not come out from nowhere, because during his entire term in the office of Lukashenko has always been trying to monopolize the discussion of Belarus and Russia relations without any competition from the pro-democratic forces. So he was trying to be the only one who shapes this agenda. But now we're seeing that authoritarian rule in Belarus and Russia is only getting stronger. The framework of freedom is shrinking. Repressions have become a norm both in Belarus and Russia, and war becomes the tool of foreign policy. After the crackdown of the post-20 crackdown in Belarus and after the aggression against Ukraine in 2022, the union of these autocracies is a threat not only to its own citizens, but to the entire architecture of regional and European security. And it is clear now that a democratization of Belarus and Russia or Belarus or Russia is not going to be enough. I mean, it wouldn't be enough to have democracy in one of these two countries for sustainable peace in Eastern Europe. That's why we decided to have an in-depth thinking about the reasons for sustainability of these autocracies, of their pressure points, and hoping that this analysis could lay the foundation for the adequate strategy for change both in Belarus and in Russia. And we're confident that deconstructing of this tandem of autocracies in Minsk and in Moscow is an urgent task, both strategically and politically. And the objective of our project is to create an intellectual platform to have a meaningful dialogue between experts, representatives of the civil society, journalists, researchers, and everyone who cannot abide by the autocracies in our region, because unfortunately they have been getting only more and more traction and getting normalized. So we wanted to try and join together the horizon for the future and do the mapping of the stakeholders who are ready to commit to owning the changes in our region. As a start, we decided to have four online conferences, Every conference included 5 representatives from these countries. We had held them in September and November of 2025, discussing the current state of affairs and possible scenarios for future development. We also analyzed the ideological underpinnings of both structures and discussed the proposals for democratic transformations. We used those discussions. We used Chatham House rules for those discussions, which created an atmosphere of trust and confidence. And the second part of the project was about the analytical processing of the findings of these conferences. And we have analyzed the transcripts to produce the policy paper that we will be discussing today, which includes the most interesting ideas, and it also includes practical recommendations for the proponents of changes, for international partners, and for everyone who is interested to see stable and democratic development of our region. And we hope that our contribution will help us create a new format for relations between Belarus and Russia in future, maybe with a spillover to the entire post-Soviet territory. And I would like to thank you again for the interest demonstrated into this topic. And now we'll start with the discussion proper. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Andrei Laurukhin, who will present the first 2 parts of the policy paper. Andrei, go ahead. So I will start with the first parts. The first part is Belarus and Russia after Putin and Lukashenko current considerations, and the second one about the scenarios for possible future. So we tried to diagnose the starting point of where we are and outline the key issues, the most relevant issues for the current state of affairs in both countries, and also trying to look at the interaction between these elements. And of course, the first thing was to outline the incompatibility of these 2 countries, including the size of the population, the size of the GDP, the military capacity, and this disparity makes this tandem that is currently being presented by Putin and Lukashenko as the only successful project of a union state where they have reanimated the allegedly egalitarian model of the USSR is far from being true. Well, because the reality is that the relations between Belarus and Russia are the ones between patron and client, where Belarus is a client, but in some aspects, as we will see, after the breakout of war in economy, when there's a huge demand for oil products in central regions of Russia because of the shelling, it turned out that in certain areas, specifically in oil refinery products, Belarus became the supplier for the Russian Federation. Secondly, there's the issue of gray import, because the sanctions policy is not synchronized for both countries, especially now after Trump visited Belarus and the deal that they struck with Belarus. They have eased sanctions a little bit, even though most of the sanctioned relations were sanctioned by the EU. This alleviation is not substantial. Still, it is being propagated and used by the Russians to actually bypass sanctions. Still, despite all these elements of this disparity, Belarus remains a client of Russia, which after the full-scale invasion is only becoming more and more dependent, and the foreign political maneuvering, this role of a pendulum that Belarus was trying to play between East and the West, swinging towards the East during the electoral cycle, and then the crackdown immediately after the elections, and then trying to swing back westwards after that. All that seemed to create more space, more for maneuvering, more headroom for Lukashenko when he was trying to bargain for everything. And then during the next electoral cycle, this pendulum swung backwards. Now there's no space, no room for this swing, because these sanctions made it impossible to have any social or cultural connections, let alone economic ties with the European countries or democratic countries of the world. But of course, the EU is the one that's most important for Belarus because it's bordering on Belarus and because a lot of logistics and economy is tied to that. And we see that some of the opposition political pools are already discussing that that Belarus is becoming more and more dependent on Russia, being pushed closer to Russia by the sanctions. And this absence of maneuver is the absence of a chance for possible integration into the European space. And this situation creates sort of a deadlock, but at the same time, it becomes a single-track fixed railroad. So it's only moving towards Russia. It's only becoming dependent more on Russia at all levels: social, political, education, economy, everything else. We are also saying that transformation to only in Belarus without the corresponding transformation in Russia will only be superficial and will only be short-lived, because it will always contain the threat of rolling back to the earlier status quo through occupation, for instance. When, for instance, Russia is trying to force certain policies, such as they're doing now in education, when they introduce the intellectual patterns that are being produced in Moscow and getting only reproduced in Belarus. And this important argument became an important element of criticism of our peer reviewer. But we need to be very clear about that, because this transformation in one country is seen as something not sufficient for the sustainable transformation in both countries. Therefore, in that respect, we're saying that deconstruction of the tandem, not only decoupling of the countries, but a proper deconstruction of these political regimes, simultaneous deconstruction, is needed to create the new paradigm of relations that could theoretically show that the democratic relations between two countries are at all possible. Ultimately, all this being conducive to bring peace back to the region. I already mentioned that the growth of economic dependence is one of the symptoms, and a quite telling symptom, we also see that the turnover between Russia and Belarus is growing. It's now as high as it used to have with all the EU countries. It's just unprecedented, and probably it will be studied further when, the turnover with the EU went from 150 billion US dollars to 67 billion dollars, and with Belarus it grew by 30% to achieve 60 billion. At the same time, the share of Russia in the trade turnover of Belarus grew from 40% to 65% in 3 years. And if we add additional logistic schemes and bypass models, we'll be looking at some 80% of Russia in Belarusian trade balance, which creates huge dependence. And no one is being able to speak about any diversification of any expert, because Lukashenko keeps saying that there needed to be a 30-30-30 model with Russia, EU, and other countries being equally present in the Belarusian portfolio. At that time, it was said to be the reason for sovereign and balanced Belarusian policy to make Belarus less vulnerable to the risks that are borne by being too dependent on one country. I've already mentioned several issues here, just wanted to outline that there's also a reverse dependent of Russia on Belarus. Gabriele also mentioned in her introductory statement that Russia is now indeed shrinking. They're not collapsing, but they're burning through their deposits, their future. But also our distinguished economists also drew attention to the fact that a collapse of the economy is unlikely to be a trigger or a reason for democratic change. Quite on the contrary, this might even create a social environment for countries to revert to the most brutal forms of disintegration and social and political chaos, especially given that there are a lot of people with carrying arms now in Russia and also abroad. And that is why the economists are saying that it would be better if these countries would build up stagnation with growing awareness between people about the reason for these changes, for these developments. At the same time, the regimes adapt and societies adapt and get used to certain things without thinking this as an issue. And in that respect, the sudden collapse creates more of a shock and creates a better understanding of reality. Just as a frog not being aware that it's being boiled unless it's fully done. We also looked at the society, saying that the societies are different even though they look the same. And this different was highlighted by our sociologists, illustrated by certain figures. Even despite the 30 years of re-civilization of Belarus in 2020, after the violence, election fraud and everything, the society demonstrated solidarity towards democratic change and pro-European future. And even despite the 5 years of terror, when 500,000 people left and more than 100,000 people have been subjected to repressions, including criminal cases, prison terms, 8 people have died in Belarusian prisons, have been killed in prisons. Also, some 15 people were killed other ways, and that of course traumatized the society, split the society into 2 parts, into pro-regime group and the opponents, which just basically made the society clamp up and become a traumatized victim that is just fleeing in the flight mode. But at the same time, the discontent is still there. It's a spring that is being tightly kept that can unwind at any moment. On the other hand, an important element is the attitude towards the war. We see that all these years, uh, uh, Belarusians have been not accepting and embracing this war, and we're strictly negative about the possible involvement and engagement. And in that respect, it's an important difference. It's an important, and our political scientist showed that over the past 5 years, despite the preferential terms and conditions offered by the military contracts in Russia, very few Belarusians decided to make use of this opportunity, so to say. Namely, in 5 years, some 15 to 30 people only made use of these opportunities, which speaks about the Belarusian society as a society that is peaceful, that doesn't want to be involved, no matter how lucrative in monetary terms that this is. However, with the Russian society, it's totally different. Every month, 30 to 50,000 people sign up, and these are the people who do this voluntarily. This is what people see as acceptable and lucrative in Russia. Unfortunately, we also see that most Russians, some 70%, according to different surveys, are for waging a war against Ukraine, and despite the drop in 2025 of those who support the continuation of the war, there are different categories supporting the war and rooting for the continuation of war. So for continuing the war, we had only 25%. At the same time, still some 70% are generally in favor of the war. And 73% still support the actions of the Russians in Ukraine, which means that the Russian society is militarized, is pro-war, and this is what makes it different from Belarusian society. Belarusian society is more atomized, it's mobilized by the propaganda, and it's not ready to own and commit to the atrocities of war. And also people are saying that it's basically the authorities that are to blame for the war, not regular people. And that means that the society is not going to basically reflect on what's happening in the theater of war. As a result, our colleagues are saying that probably it's better if society just left the Belarusians to be, while the Russian society can only bring some harm to the Russian society. But at the same time, there's a dissenting opinion, and who are saying that the interaction between civilian activists is important. It's important to use each other's experience to and basically strengthen mutually our pro-democratic positions, just to somehow move the Russian society towards democratization. And indeed, Belarusian activists in some forms are more successful, and they could indeed share their experience. even though we are all now in the same boat with Russians, because there's full scorching of the civil society space. Almost everybody has left Belarus who used to be in civil society, but still, those who ended up in other countries, they created new communities and even though they're all having difficulties and facing difficulties living abroad, still they are continuing with their activities. But of course, all that requires extra effort. All that requires huge effort to stay in touch, to stay relevant, but still they're trying to do that. And the same is happening with the Russian civil society. Maybe they're less consolidated, they're less visible, but at the same time, together with the experts, we have, specifically with the civil society experts who used to deal with elections and who used to deal with organization of many different initiatives, that both countries are now trying to reclaim and strengthen the activists, the ones that they had, and the ones that are still there to work for the benefit of these two countries. Some people are saying that it's not time for the activism. It's not time to call people to get actively involved, to be actively resisting certain things. Well, rather speaking about partisan activity, latent activity that should be targeting to just preserve the infrastructure, to use less risky and safer tactics, but still, this is the time for the more systemic and critical analysis of the society to answer the question of why in the 90s everything that they wanted to do failed. What lessons need to be drawn? What needs to be done for all of this to never happen again? And what needs to be done to prevent the societies from rolling back into authoritarianism? Also, in terms of the educational policy, we're also speaking about the reform programs that are already being produced and that need to be emphasized. There is a time for us to think about these reforms, and we need to understand what needs to happen for us to be able to implement the reforms that are currently being drafted, and in what case, which reforms will be most adequate, successful, and relevant. In the second part of our webinar about the scenarios for the possible future, we looked at 4 such scenarios. The conservative scenario, one conservative scenario that was second most probable. 2 Belarusian and 1 Russian experts voted for this scenario, including a number of arguments saying that the elites are very consolidated around their leaders, saying that also they're all bound by blood ties, by the crimes that they have committed in their countries or abroad, including military crimes or domestic crimes such as in Belarus. And that is the difference between the regimes. And also the possibility of a slight warming does not necessarily mean that the elites will be not trying to reproduce the existing status quo to stay safe, to offset the existential crisis that any change might bring for them, because they will, of course, try to protect their situations, their livelihoods. The financial elites might also be interested economically in seeing the things through as they are. At the same time, experts are saying that there are possible conflicts inside the elites, even in Belarus. because we'll look at the research done by Astapenia and Pavel Mazukevich. We're speaking about 5 different elite groups who can be possibly differentiated and who can start squabbling after the authoritarian leader steps down. So this might trigger gang wars, because the militarized part of the Russian society is quite capable of engaging the law enforcers and use them to achieve their own ambitions. Still, as part of the scenario, we're saying that the process of change in the political elites and the transit of authority is going to happen not through the change of elites, but through the maintaining of the status quo and the emergence of new leaders from among the elites. The second scenario is the penultimate in the scenario in the range of probability, because the Belarusian society and the Belarusian political elites have among themselves a request for change, request for democratization. So they want a certain detente, they want improvement in their relations with the West, and better relations, more humane relations with their own people, because the peak of terror has already been achieved, because it used to be a pendulum that swung, and now there's no swing back. And the representatives of the elites are saying that there are actually more costs to this situation than benefits, because sooner or later this might bring about risks for their own livelihoods, and it's also terrible for the foreign policy because it's inability to use their own funds. Because in Russia, they have a different logic of the pendulum that they used to have in Russia. They don't have any signs of detente. They don't have even a similar level of terror, even though Russia is moving in that direction. And they have made certain strides over the past few years. Still, they have not yet achieved the, so to say, impressive results that the Belarusians have in terms of terrorizing its own society. Therefore, there are no groups in society that are so interested, that would be so interested in liberalization and with improving their relations with the West. I mean, a number of their activists have left. Their political opposition is not that consolidated, and all that makes this scenario less probable for Russia. The dictatorship scenario is probably least probable, and there are many reasons for that, including no tradition for dictatorship. I mean, no military juntas have ever taken the office in these countries, and also the enforcers are already in the office, the special services that are basically pulling all the ropes. And this creates the situation when, and of course, even though the FSB is in power, it's unlikely that someone else is likely to start fighting for power, because the army has never had this ambition, neither in Belarus nor in Belarus. Therefore, no juntas are possible in Belarus or Russia, but does not mean that these structures will just remain passive observers if they are involved. And the last scenario, the uncontrollable chaos with probability at 40%, And there are three key factors that, according to the experts, contribute to the higher probability of this particular scenario. That includes war in Ukraine, which makes countries weaker, especially Russia, which makes the society neurotic, which creates an army of people that might start operating outside of the regulated environment, and the deterioration of the economic situation in the society might become a trigger for the social unrest. That creates an extra layer of negative capacity. The second issue is, the second factor is the deterioration of the structures as during the late years of the USSR, because whenever things turn south, people might start leaving their posts, abandoning ship, and so basically they're complying with this evil that they have to suffer. But when there will be a different evil to choose, they will be happy to do that. And neither Lukashenko nor Putin have a clear view of how the transitive authority can happen. This is the vulnerability of the regimes, because when the authority stops, there's no other authoritarian leader who can take over. And that creates opportunity, and that creates risk. Depending on what the elites will do, depending on whether they will be able to agree, is going to be an open question. This will be a shot, as one of the experts called it. And this might turn into a war of everyone against everyone. This might be a source of chaos or the start of the new order. And our experts agreed that the moment of unsustainability of chaos is short-lived, because chaos tends to organize. And the question is, what order will step in after the moments of chaos? And our experts believe that probably regionalization of Russia will happen. It will just break into isles that Belarus will have to work with. There will be many Russias rather than one Russia, maybe even decentralized, and that will not only create risks and costs, but also opportunities. Because this decentralized, fragmented Russia being fragmented into subjects, does not necessarily mean that they should be a separate country, but just break up of the vertical hierarchy in economic and political activities. For smaller countries, such as Belarus, might be a chance to restore more egalitarian and perspective relations with this country. When this Leviathan, that is Russia, becomes unable to consolidate and unify its monolithic policy. So it will be basically a multi-headed beast, ultimately more flexible to the new conditions. No, thank you. I do apologize for abusing the time frame, but we're ready to continue. Yes, thank you, Andrei. Yes, you indeed took a bit more time, which means that I will have to be brief. Now, I wanted to remind you that what we have here is a webinar, and the participants may want to send their questions to Q&A or to the chat. And I would now like to make a presentation in 2 parts. I see the questions, interesting questions, but we will definitely take them after the presentation. and after we hear from Valery. So yes, all the questions are going to be at the end. Thank you for your questions. We see them. They're great questions, and we'll definitely take them all. And probably I'm not going to go through all my slides. I will just make a few elements, points of emphasis, because I would want to highlight just the most important things about this policy paper. And also the policy paper is for your consideration. It's now available. And I will focus on two particular parts. The issue about the ideology in the present day Belarus and Russia that we have discussed, and the projects for future democratic Russia and Belarus. Why we feel that important? The section of ideology, when we were discussing it all, I myself saw the opinion that it's difficult to see whether there is an ideology in Russia, also in Belarus. But now we'll look and see what the differences are. And we have identified the ideology in Russia as the Putinistic ideology of imperial revenge. And this is what our experts came up with. But for Russia, in the Russian legislation, there's actually a prohibition for the statewide or mandatory ideology. So basically, there is no ideology in Russia formally, but still the regime is still based on the eclectic mix of the Soviet slogans, imperialistic cliches, and propaganda stints. So this modern ideology is 90% political technology and 10% ideologic components. Therefore, the ideology that they have in Russia is quite fragmented. It very adaptive to what Putin is saying, and it changes according to the current objectives. And what are these key elements of this ideology of Putinism? It is quite similar to other ideologies that were previously mentioned in other countries. First trait is the speech about the special way, because Russia is according to them, Russia is a special civilization that is surrounded by enemies, and they need to get together to protect themselves from the threats. The threats coming from the West, the threat that is, according to them, wants to break up Russia and put Russia down. Also, there's a personality cult of Putin, and the state itself is proclaimed to be the ultimate value, and the authority and power is of sacred nature, meaning that all orders need to be performed, no questions asked. And of course, this is all being built on so-called traditional values, including the religion and conventional family, even though Russia has large Muslim communities, still the Russian Orthodox Church plays the major role in the spiritual life of the country. And the spiritual values of Russia are usually juxtaposed with the so-called liberal values of the West. And they're also glamorizing the victory in the Second World War, glamorizing the past, which is used to justify all the actions of the regime. and that applies to everything not only in Russia but also outside Russia, as it was the case for war in Ukraine. Even despite all these basic ideas, there's no positive image for the future of this ideology, because the Putin's elites, they don't want to stifle themselves with rigid frameworks, and they want to be flexible in their needs and in the rationality that they use for their actions. As for the ideology in Belarus, as our experts formulated it a rather precise way, is that it's either Lukashenko or void. Even though ideology is something that is mentioned in the Belarusian constitution, in 2022 there was a referendum with certain changes being introduced, which now reads that the democracy is built in Belarus according to the ideology of the Belarusian state. Belarus has been building its ideological apparatus since early noughties, and there are different publications, different textbooks on Belarusian ideology. There are even such subject as Belarusian ideology taught as part of higher education. But at the same time, this ideology is not finally formulated. It's still quite vague and is still a neo-Soviet ideology. It's a mix of the Soviet nostalgia, paternalistic values, and also with some elements of sovereignty introduced into it as well. What are the basic elements of the Belarusian ideology? First of all is the juxtaposition of order and chaos. Chaos meaning any change, including everything that has to do with freedom, democracy, or protests. Everything like that is being presented as something that was force-fed to the Belarusian society by the external actors, by the agent provocateurs. At the same time, the regime presents itself as the guarantor of order and peace. They're also promoting social paternalism. Lukashenko himself often mentions the issue of social justice and caring for the simple folk. So all repressions, all removals of certain guarantees are being explained by the need for justice, and absence of reforms is being explained by the authorities taking care of the common folk. Even though recently they have started moving away from this paternalistic model. Some officials are now trying to shift the responsibility, shift the burden onto the general public. This is seen from the recent tax hikes. Still, they're still speaking about the budget being socially oriented. Also, the ideology of the Belarusian state is also characterized by the personality cult, because Lukashenko equals stability. Stability is the buzzword for Lukashenko, and he's presented as the only one who can save Belarus from being dragged into military action or dragged into chaos of the 90s, of the early 90s, that are being used by propaganda as the boogeyman of. And any assault on his power is interpreted as assault on Belarus, and that only became stronger post-2020. Also, the ideology exploits the memory of the Second World War, opposed to Belarus, it's all focused around the guerrilla warfare and about the popular heroism, since Belarusians are the ones who won that war. And in view of the regime, all that explains and justifies the need for repressions, and it is being seen as the necessary element for survival of Belarusians as a nation. And they have ramped up their anti-West narratives because they broke up all the relations with the West and with the United States as well. I mean, Belarusians in 2006 and in 2010 were fed the idea that Maidan was something that was a result of these attempts for democratization, and that only got stronger post-2020. So what is similar between these two ideologies? Well, first of all, that means the anti-Western rhetorics. Of course, it's being synchronized with what is being said in Russia nowadays. Also, traditional values that are being paraded both in Belarus and in Russia. Also, in Belarus, the Russian Orthodox Church does not play that big of a role because Catholicism is present in Belarus as well, and Protestants. Still, all that is being done as a juxtaposition to the liberal West. And of course, the Second World War is also being milked for ideological purposes in both countries to legitimize the violence against the opponents in Belarus and in Russia. And in Ukraine and in Russia, that meant even the spillover into other countries. Also, both of those regimes are personalistic because of the society with its machinery dominate over the society, and that of course amplifies the propaganda element. However, there are also differences between two ideologies. We also see that in Russia, this ideology is of imperialistic expansion nature, while in Belarus, the ideology is all inward focused. It is basically saying that we just need to safeguard this small piece of land that we have. And we need to stay safe and not get dragged into any military action. Of course, the ideological aggression is different between Belarus and Russia. And we also see different mechanisms that the authorities are using to spread their ideology, to force this ideology to other countries. Also, the concept level of detail is different, even though in Belarus they have numerous publications, textbooks, and everything. The level of concept development of Belarusian ideology is much lower because in Russia it's based on the idea of the third Rome, of Rусский мир and everything. In Belarus, they have not had such a well-developed concept. And in his fight against democratic forces, even from the beginning of the 90s, Lukashenko did not want to include the National Democratic Project into his ideological underpinnings. So his ideology does not look finished and fleshed out. Also, in terms of narratives, the narrative flexibility has been different. Lukashenko is trying to adapt, to change his narrative depending on the audience. Sometimes his speeches are contradictory on himself, as different from Putin, who, after the invasion of Ukraine, became very consistent in everything he says about the expansion and the goals of the Russian foreign policy. In the fourth section, our experts spoke about what our experts see the transformation of Belarus and Russia. I mean, we looked at several aspects and several dimensions, including economic reforms, public transformation, education, the role of religion and relations with the state, and also the role that can be played by a diaspora, including for the Russian and Belarusian cooperation between the civil societies or the societies of the countries. I might say something that is a bit controversial here, because this is a position that still does not see unity of opinion among the experts. As for the economic reforms, the experts all stressed that the Belarusian democratic forces, including the Tikhanovskaya office, which cooperates with the Belarusian experts, and the Belarusian analytical centers in exile, have developed different programs and concepts for economic transformation. So both Belarusian and Russian analytical centers are pursuing similar objectives, including economic stabilization and integration into global economy and integration into global business. However, the Belarusian authors tend to speak about how this is going to be perceived by the Belarusian society. So that is not disowned by the society, so that there's no backlash about the reforms, because there needs to be social responsibility. However, as programs are saying, there need to be additional elements in these reforms about that speak about the participation of the society, public participation, to create the bottom-up request and demand for reforms, as it happened, for instance, in the 90s, because the propaganda actors are still using reforms of the 90s as the scarecrow, as for the public support for change. The experts mentioned that for Russian society, paternalistic approach is typical, as opposed to the Belarusian society, which still remains pro-democratically oriented, even though the Lukashenko's regime is seeking to stifle any dissent of opinion. But in 2020, the Belarusians demonstrated unity in their attitude, and even though it was all suppressed, still latently, this yearning for democratic change remains. And I also wanted to mention that the experts mentioned the need for the opposition leaders, and of course those who will be part of this change, to take into account the opinion of the general public, without saying that if the regimes collapse, people will be supporting the democratic changes automatically. Only some 25% are likely to support those, and that is probably the highest probable value. 40% will be opposed to any change, and the rest will just be watching what's going to happen. And this is what people need to take into account. In Belarus, the pro-democratic orientation and values are more prominent and more visible. Therefore, this pro-democratic core is not that large, is not that numerous, because it is short of impossible to conduct proper sociology in Belarus. Still, 2020 showed that this is something that Belarus can be counted on for. As for the reform in education, the biggest question that was debatable among the experts, and without final consensus, is the need and the scale of possible lustration. The democratic forces need, and the opposition politicians need, to take into consideration that indeed there is a need for restoration of justice. There is a need to restore the rights of those who were repressed, who suffered, including the faculty members, students, but at the same time, this needs to be done carefully, so that the academic community would not see reforms or lustration as a revenge, because this will lead to backlash, and people will be unlikely to support democratization, and this will not win you any supporters, because people wouldn't want to be threatened. Also, during our recent roundtable, we raised the issue of relations between the religion and the state, and the experts, after they have analyzed the programs presented by the democratic forces and political actors, concluded that the role of faith-based organizations is still underrepresented and undervalued in the proposed political programs. And one of the issues that caused huge discussion was the issue of lustration, and whether the faith-based organizations and religion organizations should be purged of people who openly supported the dictators. There were different proposals. There were also extreme opinions, when certain experts said that indeed these religious actors need to be held accountable for what they did, in particular the representative of the Russian Orthodox Church. At the same time, people were saying that this will mean the involvement and interference of the state into the religious sphere, which is not acceptable for the democratic society. So the religious organizations should be given just more freedom to purge themselves of the bad apples. but probably still the faith-based organizations need to be more prominently featured in the political programs of the democratic forces. Also, we spoke about the role that diaspora plays now in the life of the society, because currently in Belarus and in Russia, it is impossible to gauge and the support for change. As a result, diaspora now is the generator of ideas for this new change. And the experts broke the diaspora into 4 different parts. The intellectuals are a group, the civil activists are a group, and all these groups, they somehow interact, and quite fruitfully, but most criticism was lashed out at migrant politicians who publicly tend to be more confrontational. And they are seen as competing for resources and scavenging rather than trying to push for a real change. They seem to be more focused on preserving the influence over the diaspora. And that, of course, speaks mostly for the Russian opposition, because the Belarusian opposition seems to be a bit more consolidated, because there's office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the undisputed center, and it's also building the political structures such as the United Transition Cabinet and the Coordination Council, and they seem to be better coordinated, even though for the Belarusian opposition there are also elements of criticism, including the need to introduce and include the interests of broader groups. Also, the experts discussed what the Belarusian and Russian cooperation with experts could look like, and that includes the scientific cooperation, which is an example, which this project of ours is an example of such cooperation. There are also projects in culture and humanitarian areas where the human rights defenders can somehow cooperate. The experts also mentioned the cooperation with faith-based organizations as a good case in point. But whenever they started speaking about whether the Belarusian and Russian politicians interact with them, in that respect, more often than not, they would say that still it's not something that's worth doing right now, and it's all limited and virtually non-existent, and maybe there is even no need for that at this stage. Thank you. I also took a bit more time than I wanted. Still, there's a QR code here that you can use to actually have a look at our entire policy paper. And I give the floor now to Andrei for the recommendations and findings. Our final section of work for today. Yes, so you should again pull down your slides so that I can pull up mine. Yes, dear colleagues, we're gradually moving towards the conclusions, but our content is of paramount importance. Therefore, I do apologize for running a bit late, but still, I wanted to indeed focus on the final part of findings and recommendations. Hopefully you can all see it now. So we have 8 key findings, 8 key recommendations. This is how it all somehow synced together. First, the regimes are not a threat to the region only in isolation. They are a threat to the region jointly when they are seen in jointly, and that is the reason why they need to be deconstructed. And this is the position. Well, because some people are saying that we're only going to democratize our own countries, and it doesn't matter what they do with each other. So no, we are saying that the consolidation of the regimes means that there's a totally new level, new sustainable level of authoritarianism, and its much more sinister expansion and spill out beyond the borders of one given country. Therefore, we are basically saying that this authoritarian alliance needs to be deconstructed on all levels. And the law enforcers are the important place where we need to start. And this is where the border lies between the destruction and constructive rebuilding. The institutes that have been created by the authoritarian regimes need to be definitely deconstructed. Secondly, over the past 4 years, we have seen the growing dependence of Belarus on Russia. It no longer has any room for maneuver that it used to have. It's no longer a pendulum that swings between different axes. And Lukashenko did not come up with anything new here. So when one of the axes was removed from the equation, this pendulum got rigidly pegged to the other axis. There needs to be a totally different model for that, which speaks about the possibilities brought about by the fourth scenario, which is all about new relationships with the Russian Federation, not detrimental to the relations with the EU and other sources of power. A democratization of Belarus alone, without democratization of Russia, is unlikely, not only because we spoke about the incompatibility between these two countries, but also the consolidation of the authoritarian regimes only becomes stronger because of the support that they extend to each other. And this important element of the external and unfortunately, this will ultimately otherwise result in the total collapse of the aspirations and delusions, which of course is a worst case scenario because it's always better to understand the risks and possible dynamics of the transformations. This is a need for the sustainable democratization of Belarus. For all aspects of interactions between the agents of change is the horizontal cooperation at the level of civil society in social and cultural spheres. And even here, there are certain frictions, there are certain challenges, because we understand that this symbolic colonization is currently happening in the area of culture and civil society and dedication. This is happening even in democratic and pro-democratic structures, even in immigration. Therefore, this work to critically rethink ourselves and critically rethink the relations between the big brother and little brother towards more egalitarian and free relationship is a must. And that goes for Belarusians and for Russians. So we need to deconstruct and critically rethink our own agency, which is a must for successful transformation. Out of 4 analyzed scenarios, the most probable are disorderly chaos and dictatorship. Together with the experts, we see that most experts saw uncontrollable chaos to be the source of more positive opportunities to deconstruct the Russian Federation, to dismantle the hierarchy, the Moscow-centric monolith, which will offer more opportunities for Russians and for other countries, including Belarus, which is mostly dependent. And the economists suggested interesting models to cooperate horizontally with different entities if such deconstruction and decentralization will happen, and will happen to the benefit of Russia and Belarus. Even a small time lag has certain risks and opportunities associated with it. By saying that in case of step down of Lukashenko and Putin, the risk of dependency or blatant protectorate over Belarus by Russia is only getting higher. And in that respect, this synchronicity or the reverse order of their step down has fewer risks associated with it for Belarus, both for the sovereignty and for the citizens of the country. Even if we're saying that indeed Lukashenko remains in office with all the terror that is associated with it, still, if that is coupled with certain changes in Russia, this will create a certain point of instability, and that still creates fewer risks than if Lukashenko was stepped down before Putin. Also, the politicians remain the weak element of this chain, especially given the conflicting nature of the Russian political actors in exile. Even though the new group for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, with participation of the Secretary General, hopefully will enable the possible consolidation, which is a positive signal that, of course, offers some optimism. Also, out of the 4 groups that we mentioned, the experts, scientific, social, and humanitarian, and horizontal cooperation across these groups and with this civil society and within the civil society is also a must. This, of course, means that there are already certain sprouts of this cooperation, as evidenced by the recent releases of the political prisoners. This is an important moment that indeed could be taken as a basis, but of course it's too early to speak about the possibility of cooperation, political cooperation between the Russian and Belarusian diaspora. At the same time, the experts have identified certain limitations towards the implementation of these strategies in case of in case of the opening of the window of opportunity. We don't know the baseline at the time of this opening. Also, there's a weak connection with the society. The longer the people live in exile. And of course, the confrontation is important, and the conflicts are only growing, and that only creates better cumulative effect. And this environment where everybody is free to pursue their own interests might create more negative developments. And finally, a few more factors. It's also important to understand what the political situation will look like for other actors. This is yet an important element that needs to be taken into account for the case of the possible window of opportunity opening. With this, I would like to give the floor to Valery, because Valery was our peer reviewer. I also wanted to mention that the full version of our policy paper is downloadable. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I mean, of course, the project is relevant because the need for project for transformation is important, because the issue is relevant for the neighboring countries, especially given that there is a war going on in Ukraine. We need to stress the analytical level, also the clear language. Also, we need to highlight the methodological issue. The authors are trying to look into the future. This is a highly risky issue because all scenarios for the future are based on the projections and the attempt to make projections, and because only the public practice is the criteria of the research truth. Therefore, critical evaluation needs to be subjected to the same limitations. Speaking about what could be theoretically is an interesting task, but it does not necessarily bring us closer to the truth. The second methodological issue. The authors tried to bring into one research three different problems. First is the prospects of democratic transformations of Russia. Second, the prospects of democratic transformation of Belarus. And then the prospect of the Belarusian and Russian relations, the future of the Union state, the model of integration in the condition of the possible reforms. The very idea of looking at the possibility of democratic transformation into countries as a single organism is quite risky, because even though they might look similar from the outside, the socio-political processes in these two countries are quite different. And if the regimes are also quite similar, the Belarusian and Russian societies are very different. They are quite different items for research and subjects for research, and the authors also make a disclaimer about that. And even if we attach the issue of relations between Belarus and Russia and the possible integration options, this creates a serious research challenge. As for the content of the research, of course, the third section about the present-day ideology is less challenging and less disputable. because this is the study of reality of today. Here, everything is quite clear. It creates a space for a rather narrow space for interpretations. They have very clearly identified the postulates of the ideology of Lukashenko and Putin. But I guess an important ideological element should be added here, which is also crucial for both regimes, which is about the fact that West is a degrading civilization, and it is now being juxtaposed by the global the rest of the global countries, including Russia and Belarus. Basically, they're saying that we are on the right side of history. We are at the surf of the global development. This is an important element that actually tends to work. I mean, it strikes a chord with the general public. Also, the recommendations are quite clear, especially those that pertain to the political structures, to the NGOs. Quite clear that most questions arise around the scenarios for change, because this is where there's a lot of space for subjective interpretation. I would agree with the finding that the change in Belarus and Russia can only happen after and when Putin and Lukashenko are removed from the office. The possibility and probability of other options is negligibly low. The scenario of manageable chaos is seen as most probable by the authors. Well, the removal of Putin and Lukashenko will create a crisis. And of course, it will be because there's no legal mechanism for the authority, for transitive authority, because both of the regimes are personified. But the crisis does not necessarily mean ungovernable chaos. It is very difficult to imagine a chaos situation in Belarus. The authors are saying that unmanageable chaos in both countries will most likely become the transition to the new order. If they use ungovernable chaos and would use the word chaos, crisis instead, we could possibly agree with that. Out of those four analyzed scenarios, after the alleged step down of Putin and Lukashenko, the most probable is deemed to be a conservative scenario, and the one that means that status quo remains. At the same time, 20% of the experts said that the detente is also possible. I guess here it reflects the problem that I already mentioned, meaning that the very idea of considering democratic transformation of Belarus and Russia as a single social organism is quite risky. Because what goes for Russia, this ratio of 30-20 is quite realistic, but for Belarus, I guess it should be inverted. Also, for the benefit of the conservative variant, people are saying that both regimes have a certain strength and rigidity, and the elites know their place. But both in Russia and Belarus, the biggest governmental institute is the institute of the leader. And the system is built to mimic the actions of one person and caters to one person. He is the only decision maker, and everyone else is frozen in the execution limbo. And in case of step down, how much agency do these institutes have? While the officials who are in their place used to be a tool in the hands of the leader, and in his absence might want to become the political agents. They might result into conflicts, the so-called ungovernable chaos, or this could result in their collusion. I mean, this is something that people have already come up with. It's called parliament elections and democratic transformations. Also, another important element is neglected. The disappearance of a leader will create the situation of the stupor of power. And at that point, the political arena might see new actors emerge, the new actors that we don't even know about. Maybe, for instance, the people might want to become a political agent as it wanted to be in 2020. Also, opposition, the Western partners, the new ruling team will have the challenge of finding new legitimacy. While the previous ruler was popular, such as Putin in Russia, it would be only reasonable to call themselves their political survivors, their political descendants. But in Belarus, however, the only possible way is de-Lukashenization. Also, the conservative scenario in Belarus might result in conservative detente, which will not change the situation. It's basically about the slight improvement of the political regime without major change. And this will lead to some superficial weakening of the regime without any major change in its democratic nature. However, this is what the theory of change calls the unexpected consequence of the decision making. But that does not mean that cosmetic detente will not create meaningful opportunities, because there's a growing momentum that sometimes cannot be stopped, such as the Gorbachev's perestroika, or in Belarus, the cosmetic detente of 2015-2019, which was called the soft Belarusization period, prepared the conditions for the revolutionary process of 2020. We can discuss around the argument of whether democratization of Belarus is possible without democratization of Russia or gradual transformation of Belarus. Well, it's unlikely. The biggest threat is if Lukashenko steps down earlier than Putin, and Putin would want to appoint a new governor for Belarus. I actually don't like this fatalism of reasoning now that no change is possible unless Russia allows for such change. Let's start with saying that present-day Russia does not have any experience and does not have a successful case of appointing their protege in post-Soviet republics. I mean, influencing political mechanisms is one thing. This is what they have been doing quite successfully. But sending their protege is actually less likely, because even in Ukrainian occupied territories, Russia tends to imitate legitimacy. They hold the so-called referendum on annexation. Therefore, the successor of Lukashenko needs to be brought through the process of elections. And any election, even a controlled election, such as in 2020, has bear with them a risk of political shock. The new leadership of Belarus, to preserve the political stability, will need to have double legitimacy. One will be sourced from Russia, but the second source of legitimacy is something that needs to come one way or another from the Belarusian society and the elites. In Soviet times, every socialistic leader, in addition to the ticket from Moscow, had to win popularity among its people. and the new leader will have to start from scratch. It's not easy, and KGB will not be sufficient to plug all the gaps. And falling back only on Moscow is not a winning solution. In 2024, in Abkhazia, as a result of the protests, the president was ousted. But the influence of Russia over Abkhazia is much better than over Belarus. Still, the reviewed work creates a huge space for discussion. Maybe this is probably its ultimate value. Thank you. Thank you, Valery. I mean, we have already discussed certain elements of this discussion after we have received the review. Maybe we'll hear some inputs from someone. Maybe some of our colleagues who are here. I have already answered all the questions that were sent to Q&A. I don't know, Dmitry, can we give anyone the floor if they want it? I mean, we can convert people to the panelist status if people want, but they want to, but we need people to raise their hands. And while people are thinking, even though we have discussed it with Valery, the most meaningful comments have been well received because we are grateful for these comments. They're all justified and well-grounded. I mean, this is a criticism that made us revisit our arguments and give them another thought. But the counter-argument, the basic counter-argument that I think is worth mentioning is that which is about whether the Belarus and Russia can be seen only in a tandem and not separately. Well, like you saw in our presentation, we're still stuck with this argument, the way it was originally outlined in the policy paper, because the degree of interdependentness and the interconnection, that it would be unrealistic to think that democratization in Belarus will just be done with Russia simply observing. And secondly, if some democratization, some sort of democratization happens in Russia, then we can also assume that even if Lukashenko will go on terrorizing his citizens, the Russians might not want to interfere. I don't think that this is the right way of doing things. I think because that contradicts the policy that we count on the countries of the EU when we say that all that happens in Belarus also pertains to democratic countries when certain violations happen, when terrible things happen, when atrocities are committed against humanity. And of course, we mean Ukraine, first of all. The second important element is the counter-argument that Valery mentioned, that protectorate is unlikely in Belarus. But in our discussion, I mentioned that we live in a new logic these days. It's not the pre-2020 logic when Russia indeed demonstrated and exercised certain caution and did not use blunt force to send troops to other countries. But that happened in Georgia, that happened in Pridnestrovia. But the way it's happening now in Ukraine, I guess, opens a totally new page and disrupts the organizational logic that we used to have, which means that Putin and regime have crossed the red line when military action in Belarus was unimaginable, used to be unimaginable, and would have disrupted the peaceful stalemate between the countries of the region that is supposed to be important for the elites. I guess we're past that, and I think that the parties have nothing to lose, and military interventions are just nothing of extraordinary. I mean, it's costly, but does not mean that they will refrain from ever considering that and doing that. And if they see that as the easiest way of addressing their issues, they will take this shortest path, and they will do that without thinking about the cost, especially for Belarus. Even if that was made possible for Ukraine, for a country that at the time was 5 times bigger than Belarus, still that was possible. And for Belarus, this will even more possible. And the value of Belarus, of a country where good Russians can be found, and the country that is that dependent and that important for Russia, both symbolically and strategically, I guess in this situation, the most unexpected but simple and tools such as occupation cannot be ruled out. Therefore, whenever we speak about protectorate, quite possibly, I mean, earlier we would not think these things possible, but in the world of today, in the world that has been shaping after the onslaught on Ukraine, I think this is quite possible because we live in a different logic. We live in a logic of new development, and we see how it's now being developed and how they're now probing the ground for all that, for unexpected behavior of the politicians from Russian Federation and Putin, first and foremost. So that would be my response to the 2 arguments presented by Valeri. Of course, I also need to agree that speculating about the future is always a matter of uncertainty. But at the same time, we simply must think about the future, and we must but project, because indeed our attempts are weak, they are not 100% meaningful. We're also speaking about improbabilities and uncertainties, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. And we need to try and make sense about this uncertain future. We just need to be more meticulous and thorough about it, trying to use the entire toolkit that we have to try and get more prepared for the possibilities that the future might bring, other than just going with the flow. And I think that both in terms of what we feel and what we see, and in terms of if we just made to suffer what we must, rather than trying to trying to carve for ourselves what we need. So that would be my 2 cents. I would want to ask my colleagues if we have any reactions. If not, we will hear from Valery probably. As for the probability and the possibility of the Russian aggression against Belarus, we need to be very clear about what Belarus is for the Russian elites and for the Russian society. Belarus is a role model. It's a template. I mean, if all they're saying that if all of the countries acted as Belarus, it would all be good and great. And the war against Ukraine is an attempt to make Ukraine, to shape it and mold it like Belarus. And in this situation, waging a war against Belarus would be like shelling their own city. But why not? Has that ever stopped Russians? But to prepare a war against Ukraine, Russia had to be prepping up ideologically from 2012. They had to be aggressive. They had to be waging the campaign against Ukrainian citizens and their leadership. And only after that, Putin felt safe to wage aggression. With Belarus, it's even more challenging because Lukashenko was exploiting the imperial complexes of Russia, saying that they are brotherly nations. I mean, that would be very challenging to make a political decision about that. That would be my take on things. I would like to say a few words here as well. We're speaking about extremes, right? And we're speaking about, because these are extremes, right? In the context of democratization in certain conditions. Of course, Putin is unlikely to want to get aggressive, but nobody expected aggression against Ukraine in 2022, for instance, right? Probably not a single expert. I mean, not many people wanted to speak about that, and that came as a huge shock, huge surprise. The same may come as a surprise for Belarus, but at the same time, we're now speaking about the military aggression as part of context. And now in the context of democratization, yes, indeed, there are cases when Russia did not send troops to protect the toppled regime, such as in Abkhazia. But they did not change the geopolitical orientation and the nature of authorities there. The nature of the regime stayed the same. We can also remember the Armenian Revolution when Pashinyan came to power. Yes, indeed, Russia did not invade and did not install their military protectorate, but still. And the reasons probably were about the deep connection between Armenia and Russia. So this country that is bordering on Azerbaijan and Turkey, which is the only ally there is Russia, and probably less now because Russia is now bogged down in Ukraine, and they're not offering any security guarantees for Armenia, and that's why Armenia is now getting reoriented. But anyway, so with these changes of regimes, including in Armenia, nobody spoke about making a geopolitical choice. or European integration or turning towards the West. The same can happen if the regime changes in Belarus. But with Belarus, the question is different. I mean, how strong is the pro-European sentiment, and how much of a review will be on the table for the Belarusian and Russian relations if something happens in Belarus, something that Ukraine wanted to have for themselves when they started reorienting towards the EU, when they started denouncing all the agreements and started backtracking on all the integration models that Putin was pushing. And this is what it brought about for Ukraine. It brought about war. And in that respect, the democratic changes in Belarus and the orientation towards the EU might be associated with a greater risk. And in that respect, I guess we might and should be speaking about what Russia might do. We have seen what it did for Ukraine. They started a war. Probably it's unlikely that Russia will resort to a different tool for Belarus if Belarusian people would indeed topple the regime and will start working towards the West and toward greater democracy. Even though, let alone, there was no union state between Ukraine and Russia, but Russia has a union state with Belarus, so there's even more pegging of Belarus on Russia. So this is where we come from when we project certain risks, when we plan and speculate about them. We're not saying that there are no risks. I don't like the fatalism that is associated with this scenario. That's it. I mean, yes, we should not be fatalistic. I guess everybody's clear about that. Because whenever we spoke about the future, we did not try to analyze the future. We tried to formulate the pathways and scenarios of how these developments might take place. And on the basis of what is there. And we try to make sense of what the Belarusian society, the democratic forces, and foreign partners should do so that they mitigate the negative fallout or choose the path that will bring about the democratic future. This is what it's all about. Yes, indeed, probably we need to have another look at it, at the wording, at the language, because we're not being fatalistic. We're speaking about the threats that are more or less probable. And I wanted to once again draw your attention to the fact that we're still trying to think in terms that were relevant before the war in Ukraine, because it was all true for the world where war in Ukraine was thought unthinkable. Now we have been 4 years into the world where the routine is that Russia and Ukraine are at war, which means that this is the Pandora's box that is open, which means that aggression against any country, including the EU country, is not seen as totally improbable. let alone that is not seen improbable for Belarus, which is right next to Russia. Yes, of course, we can say that if we'll speak about the normal pre-war logics, the war against Belarus would just be a cognitive dissonance. But then again, we see that Ukraine is a case in point of it being possible. Therefore, I don't think that one should rule out such scenario entirely. Of course, the golden medium between the extreme is the certainty is, of course, it's not, we're not saying that. While at the same time, we're also not speaking about the impossibility of the scenario of occupation. So we are trying to make sense of the middle ground between these two extremities. Also trying to think about which will be the most probable development between these two extremes. And in that respect, I agree with Valery in his saying that that with all dependence on Russia, we should not undervalue and underestimate the possibility of independent development of Belarus. That democratization of Belarus might happen on its own. We've never said that. We're just saying that democratization of Belarus is likely to be more sustainable and secure and successful if it is followed by certain changes in Russia, not necessarily democratization. We also spoke about fragmentation, right? This is the general notion that includes federalization and more radical forms of collapse. This is not democratization per se, but it's still a factor that will contribute to the processes in Belarus running smoother without external influence. And I also see a certain convention among the political forces of Belarus and the expert community saying that we don't want to think about what's going to happen in Russia. We don't even want to talk about that. Why? Because we want to democratize Belarus. We live in Belarus, we're focused in Belarus, and we'll do everything that pertains to Belarus. This myopic vision, in addition to being naive, has a number of negative implications that might be terrible for those who believe to be agents of change. Because this is what makes us say that we feel that democratization of Belarus should be seen as something that is coupled on democratization in Russia. The reason for that being the degree of dependence and the real threat that is coming from such a neighbor and such neighborhood. So with all this, with all the complexity of this issue, I agree that democratization in Belarus and in Russia are both very challenging and difficult equations with multiple variables. Still, this is the social and political reality. In that respect, we cannot say that we can only be speaking about democratization in Belarus without looking at the rest of the world. I mean, that would be comfortable. This will be conducive to solidarity, to patriotism, but this will not be realistic. And this could be even damaging to our sovereignty as compared to what we might do when looking at the complex issue of working of two agents of change of two different countries working together, influencing each other. So this is the reality. This is the political and socio-political reality that is more challenging, less predictable, because people who live in these countries have free will, despite the authoritarian regimes, and they might change their behavior, which is the social political reality, because social and political sciences deal with such volatile objects, so to say. Well, colleagues, I suggest this is where we call it a day, if you don't mind, because we're only starting it. And with this policy paper, I indeed agree with Valery in his saying that I'm sure we'll be revisiting these discussions, and we will be grateful to everyone who finds it useful. Because we want to continue, we want to make it more argumentative, more critical, to move forward in our thinking, to indeed achieve certain relevance in our understanding of the situation. Because this is the foundation, this is the prerequisite of the success of our action. Because everyone's saying that stop talking, start doing. But if we don't know what we're doing, don't understand what we're doing, we might end up doing things that the future generations will be unhappy addressing. So the first thing that we need to do is to understand adequately where we are and what that means and what that might bring about. Thank you, dear colleagues. I suggest, Dmitry, that we wrap it up. We have indeed abused the timeline, and I wanted to mention that this is the policy paper that has been made public on our webpage. You can download it. It's available in 2 languages, English and Russian. There's also one in Belarusian that will be uploaded soon, and I hope that we will continue our discussion with more relevant topical nuances. Thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Andrei. Thank you, Valery. Thank you, Gabriele. Gabriele has already left because she had to run. So have a good night.